creating when I'm talking about memories or histories. They're always characters, they're not always necessarily me, even if I'm performing a version of myself. So that's something I always struggle with, and I think I'm always very careful with the pronouns I use in my poems, because I think as a bisexual person, people often project certain things onto me and like the genders of people I might be speaking about in my poems, so for me it's quite important to have gender neutral people. And I rewrote one of the poems I was doing today as I was performing it because I used the word beard in it, and I think there are so many interesting ideas around hair and queerness and how those things intersect. So yeah, it's something I think about a lot. Thank you. Yeah.
And does anyone else have anything to add on kind of like identity and how autobiography kind of influences your work at all? No? Okay, I'll move on to the next one. Anvi, I was really interested in the book and that you mentioned your biography, and I wondered if you could, I feel like it's a really big question, but if you could tell us a bit more about this and kind of what you've observed about feminism from a kind of more like global perspective.
So basically, I'm very much used to writing poetry and fiction. That's like my comfort zone. But there was this, it might be a bit elaborate, please cut me off if I'm going too long. I heard this sentence in 2013 when I was backpacking around Wales, and I stayed at a stranger's place. It's a long story. She told me this sentence, and she said, "Did we cultivate wheat, or did wheat cultivate us?" And that stuck in my head, and that was the starting point of the book. And I remember a month or two later, I had written the first essay that is in the book, which talks about how civilization started, and this idea of civilization might be the starting point of the troubles that we have in the current day. And coming to the question of how feminism can be the answer to global narratives at the moment, I feel like gender is the first starting point of identification for anyone. Your physical body, with whatever you identify as, the minute you look in the mirror, that's the first thing that you see, and then you have the different layers, and which is a very personal journey for each of us. So the minute you take away the distinction between sex, automatically I feel every other distinction would stop mattering. If your gender doesn't matter, how does your religion matter? How does your ethnicity matter? How does your sexual orientation matter? How does your skin color matter? The starting point for me, as far as I have observed until now, is gender. So the minute you have man and woman on an equal scale, everything else would fall into perspective, because, I mean, on a global level, we would all be on an equal standing, I feel. And then probably we might have healthy discussions on what is ethnicity, what is religion, blah, 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 but we wouldn't have problems relating to that. So that, in the gist of it, that's what the book, it's called Unsupervised, Global Narratives Through a Feministic Perspective. So if you have a chance to check it out, it's on Amazon. And anything else?
Okay. The next question then. So this is for you, but it can also be answered by anyone. So I was wondering about, because you've specifically mentioned your activism and organisations you've been involved with, how you kind of see the connection between arts and activism.
Thank you. This is a really good question, and one that I wish I had a definitive answer to, but I really don't. So if any of you guys have things to weigh in, please hit me up with answers on a postcard. I think that sometimes the relationship between art and activism is really explicit, and sometimes it's not at all, but it's kind of still as valid. So thinking about like musicians that I've admired and like been inspired by, does anyone know Kathleen Hanna of like Bikini Kill, Les Tigres, what's her other band, the Julie Ruin? Especially with Bikini Kill, she used her shows as literal rallies for kind of feminist points of view. So in my mind, she's like the pinnacle of kind of really explicitly using your music, your art, to make a political point and to kind of gather people around a political movement. On the other hand, there are artists I love who, like I'm thinking specifically of female artists here, who don't talk publicly about feminism at all. I don't know if they would identify as feminists, for example, like Regina Spektor, who nonetheless, I think by being kind of vocally female in the public sphere, are contributing to, I don't know, the sense that women's voices deserve to be heard and that it's appropriate and necessary for women to be loud in public. So I don't think it's always kind of necessary for a woman to voice her political opinions vis-a-vis feminism as part of her art in order to contribute to feminist culture, if that makes sense. And then with regard to my own music and where I think feminism fits into that, it's not the theme of everything that I write, but I think that through performing on a stage, I've become more comfortable with the idea of taking up space. And I think that is a feminist struggle, isn't it? Whether that's taking up space in the sense of believing that your voice matters in public, in a meeting, in your friendships, in your romantic relationships, or, you know, taking up physical space, like on the bus when a man is sitting too close or is catcalling you or whatever. Yeah, I think, in my mind at least, there's a connection between getting used to being on a stage versus kind of becoming increasingly more comfortable with taking up space kind of in my personal life. Yeah, and then I've been involved with some like explicit feminist causes. So you mentioned Hollaback, who are, I don't know if you guys have come across them before. They are an anti-street harassment charity. So they document and kind of inform people about ways of coping with reacting against street harassment, especially looking at that as a gendered issue. So catcalling, sexual harassment, all these kinds of things, they equip women and other people with the tools to kind of fight back against that. And they're also involved with like just literally documenting these things. So you can if you've been sexually harassed, you can send in your story to them. They kind of have these big maps that they present to governments and policymakers around the world, because often a big part of kind of changing public life is just documenting issues, like just presenting the evidence that it's a real thing. So yeah, I've done like shows with them in Oxford, all sorts of things, which leads me on to like my final point. I think sometimes art is just a starting point for a conversation. So I know that through kind of gigging with Hollaback, I've had conversations with women, both who I know personally, colleagues and whatnot, and also women who just come on to shows about sexual harassment, which kind of goes all the way from being kind of catcalled on the streets right through to rape, and people have kind of confided all sorts of things in me, and that's been really helpful. So in those conversations, I don't think would have happened if I wasn't kind of playing music and talking about these things publicly. So I think making art can be a helpful starting point. But yeah, if anyone else has got any thoughts on like art and activism, let me know.
Pussy Posse had a really good feminist exhibition up in Edinburgh while I was there with Grrrowls. And also Holly Cassio, she's a zine artist. She's also got a zine about taking up space, that sort of subject about how she's a big woman, so she often feels like she doesn't have the right to take up space. So the zine was all about that as well. So 2 points that are relevant to what you mentioned.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you can always feel free to share and we can kind of spread the word. I think it's nice to be able to kind of make those connections as well after to kind of help people out in that way as well. I found it interesting talking about people kind of labelling themselves as feminists, like particularly musicians, because I think within recent years people who have sort of rejected the label have been kind of more accepting of it, and I was always really surprised by PJ Harvey, because I was like, songs are so feminist, like what? But yeah, that was a really interesting point, and I think it's particularly with music, has been maybe more so than poetry, arguably, more male-dominated. And last year I worked in Spain at a language school, and there were kind of like all these different posters around different kind of English-speaking bands, and all of them were all men. So I made a point of making a display in my classroom with like 90% women musicians, and making the children write about them and research them.
Can I make that point?
Yeah.
On the topic of the music industry being male-dominated, so I think sometimes people have got the perception that like music is a pretty female-friendly space, just because like when you look at the charts, there's like a decent amount of kind of women in the top 10 often, but behind the scenes, like super not. So like it's like less than 5% of sound engineers are women. People kind of running their record labels are more often not guys. And even like as you mentioned, even like in kind of festivals and kind of live performances, you'll still quite commonly see all male bills. So yeah, if anyone here has got any like budding musical talents, like please go into music and like start making that change happen, and like continue supporting female musicians as well, and like challenging festivals and places when they have all male bills, because like we don't need this. It's 2018. Like come on guys. So yeah, thanks.
Great. So I think we're kind of needing to wrap up a bit, but if anyone else wants to add anything on that.
Just to last
Yeah.
point. It's so funny when we talk about every field being male dominated, there is a slight exclusion when it comes to Indian dancing, probably ballet as well, but I'm not very sure. So Indian classical dancing, males are not allowed to do it. Not allowed to in the sense society doesn't usually accept them. And it's a very funny thing, because the reason for it is ridiculous, because they feel the dancing makes them very feminine and nobody will marry them and blah 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 blah. But when you look at the Indian classical, the career scene, the professional scene as such, you see 99% women, and that makes me so happy, whatever the reason is. So I just wanted to point that out. It's very weird, the reasons, how the reasons play out and how the politics play out in different fields. It's quite strange.
Thanks. And if anyone from the audience has any final questions, you're welcome. If not, we shall move on to our final song. Okay, great. Thank you.
Let's do this as quickly as possible. Sure, yeah, we can do I thought I would just keep the crisps here, because it's like a nice little punk rock touch. I'm sure that Sid Vicious like always has.